For nearly 300 years, China and Korea both lived in fear of an enemy they called the Wokou, the dwarf pirates, raiders said to sail out of Japan and tear apart entire coastal provinces. The earliest wave of these raids actually has a more sympathetic origin than the propaganda term suggests. After the failed Mongol invasions of Japan in the 13th century, islanders on Tsushima, Iki, and the Goto Islands were left in extreme poverty, their farmland ruined and their position as a frontier buffer zone offering no real path to recovery. Raiding the Chinese and Korean coast under those circumstances wasn't an act of organized national aggression on Japan's part, and no one in Kyoto was directing it. It was what desperate, displaced men with boats and nothing left to lose did, when the alternative was simply starvation. And historians who study this period describe these early raiders not as agents of any government, but as marginal men, drawn from whichever coastal population happened to be hungry enough that year. The single most powerful pirate lord this enemy ever produced, the man whose fleet Chinese county seats and threatened Nanjing itself, was born inland in Anhui Province, China, and never had a single drop of Japanese blood in him. His name was Wang, and his story starts about as far from piracy and as far from Japan as it's possible to get. He came from a family of salt merchants in Shi County, a respectable, unglamorous trade dealing in one of the most tightly regulated commodities in the Chinese economy. When that business failed, sometime around 1540, Wang relocated to Guangdong Province with a group of business partners looking for a new way to make money. What he found there wasn't legitimate trade, it was smuggling. And the reason smuggling was the only growth industry available to him says a lot more about Ming China's own policy than it does about Wang Ji's character. The Ming Dynasty had imposed haijin, a sweeping ban on private overseas trade, in an attempt to control commerce and keep the coast secure. The ban didn't reduce demand for foreign goods, it just made supplying that demand illegal, which meant every merchant who wanted to keep selling silk, cotton, and saltpeter to buyers in Japan and Southeast Asia had to do it outside the law or not at all. Wang chose outside the law. By 1544, he joined the pirate syndicate run by the Shu brothers, based at Shuangyu in Zhejiang, and he rose through their ranks fast, becoming financial supervisor, fleet commander, and military counselor all at once. They called him Captain Wu Feng. The single most consequential thing Wang ever did had nothing to do with raiding a Chinese town. On September 23, 1543, he personally escorted a group of Portuguese traders to the small Japanese island of Tanegashima and acted as their interpreter, explaining to local lords exactly how their matchlock firearms worked. Those guns spread across Japan almost immediately, eventually named Tanegashima after the island where they first arrived, and went on to reshape the entire Sengoku period, arming the very armies that fought the wars this channel's already covered in detail. A Chinese smuggler trying to make a sale is the reason European firearms entered Japanese warfare when they did. The local lord who bought those first two matchlock muskets, Tanegashima Tokitaka, immediately put a swordsmith to work trying to copy them. And the project nearly stalled out on a single technical problem, drilling a helical screw thread into the barrel so the breech plug could be seated tightly enough to fire safely, a technique that simply didn't exist in Japanese metalworking yet. It took another year, and a Portuguese blacksmith brought back specifically to solve that one problem, before Japanese smiths could reliably reproduce the weapon at all. Once they could, the spread was almost immediate. Tanegashima muskets transforming Japanese battlefield tactics within a handful of years, all traceable back to a Chinese pirate doing his job as an interpreter on a sales call. He profited from that introduction for years afterward too, supplying the saltpeter Japan needed to manufacture gunpowder and exporting Japanese sulfur back the other way, a trade lucrative enough on its own to make him extraordinarily wealthy even before his pirate fleet grew into anything resembling a private navy. When the Ming Navy destroyed the Shuangyu base in 1548, Wang didn't retreat to China. He relocated permanently to Japan, settling on the Goto Islands and at Hirado, securing protection through direct agreements with local daimyo, including the politically significant Otomo and Ochi clans. At the height of his operation, he employed up to 2,000 workers at Hirado alone and owned hundreds of ships. His raids, the very raids recorded in Chinese sources as Wokou attacks, the work of supposed Japanese pirates, could field fleets large enough to defeat garrison troops and lay siege to county seats. China's own capital region wasn't even safe from the threat he represented. This is where the ethnic math behind the word Wokou stops holding up. A 1555 Ming military record, describing one specific raiding party operating that year, broke its composition down as roughly 30% ethnic Japanese and 70% Han Chinese. A separate report from a government censor in 1553 offered a different breakdown entirely, claiming raiders were 10% foreign barbarians, 20% Ryukyu Islanders, and the remainder drawn from the Chinese coastal regions of Fujian and Ningbo. The two estimates disagree on the details, but they agree on the one fact that mattered least to the people actually using the word Wokou at the time. Most of the pirates terrorizing the Chinese coast under that name were not actually Japanese. Part of the reason this discrepancy never got corrected in the public record at the time comes down to a fairly mundane bureaucratic incentive. Local Chinese officials were paid more for capturing or killing pirates, classified as foreign raiders, than for dealing with domestic bandits, since foreign piracy reflected worse on a different chain of command than ordinary local crime did. That bounty structure created a direct financial reason to relabel captured or executed Chinese criminals as Japanese pirates after the fact, inflating the apparent scale of the foreign threat while quietly erasing the actual scale of domestic banditry from the books. At least one exposed case involved a so-called Japanese pirate raid that had actually been carried out by Chinese cavalry operating far inland, nowhere near a coastline a real seaborne raiding party could have even reached. The scale of the broader crisis, regardless of who was actually doing the raiding, was real. During the reign of the Jiajing Emperor, between 1522 and 1566, Ming records document roughly 601 separate pirate raids, with the heaviest concentrations in Zhejiang province, which absorbed around 207 of them, and the Jiannan region, which absorbed around 192. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a sustained, decades-long crisis severe enough that the Ming court eventually needed two of its most capable military commanders, Qi Jiguang and Yu Daiyu, to design entirely new coastal defense doctrines and field forces specifically built to counter the raiding pattern. Qi Jiguang's approach started with who he recruited rather than how he armed them, deliberately drawing his new regiments from miners and farmers around Yiwu County because he judged them more honest and harder working than the soldiers already on the books, then drilling them into a disciplined force and overseeing construction of 44 new naval vessels built specifically for fighting at sea. The results came fast once the new troops were ready. In 1558, he won a decisive engagement at Sen Harbor alongside Yu Daiyu and another general, Tan Lun. The following year, a month-long campaign through Taizhou Prefecture inflicted more than 5,000 pirate casualties. By 1562, he'd eliminated three major pirate strongholds, at Hangzhou, Niutian, and Lindun, within a span of 2 months, and the following year retook the city of Xinhua with a force of 10,000 troops, effectively ending Fujian's pirate problem within the year that followed. The crisis that the word Wokou had blamed on Japan took a Chinese general rebuilding the Chinese military from the ground up, county by county, to actually bring under control. Ming China wasn't the only government burning resources on this problem. Korea had been dealing with Wokou raids for over a century before the Jiajing-era crisis even peaked, and the patience finally ran out after a wave of raids in 1418 and 1419 hit the Korean coast hard enough that the government decided diplomacy alone wasn't going to solve it. In 1419, it launched the Oi invasion against the pirate haven on Tsushima Island, sending 227 ships and over 17,000 soldiers under General Yi Zhangmu. The expedition captured 129 pirate vessels and burned nearly 2,000 houses on the island. It worked well enough that by 1443, Korea and the So clan that controlled Tsushima negotiated the Treaty of Geihei, a formal trade arrangement that significantly cut down on raiding along the Korean coast for a full generation afterward. Piracy, in other words, wasn't simply an uncontrollable plague visited on innocent neighbors. It was, at least in part, a symptom that responded to the right combination of military pressure and a legitimate trade outlet, the same lesson China would eventually try and largely fail to apply to Wang himself. Japan's own central government had reasons to want the Wokou problem solved that had nothing to do with protecting Chinese or Korean coastlines. Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, more than a century before Wang rise, had cracked down on piracy specifically to clear the way for legitimate tribute trade with Ming China, going so far as to accept the deliberately demeaning title King of Japan from the Ming court in 1404 in exchange for being permitted to sell Japanese swords on the Chinese market through official channels. A shogun was willing to accept a title that publicly subordinated Japan to China specifically because legal trade access was worth more than the insult. Piracy threatened that arrangement from below every time an unauthorized raid embarrassed the shogunate in front of its trading partner, which gave Japan's own government a stake in suppressing exactly the kind of activity Wang would later turn into an empire. By 1555, the Ming court decided negotiation might accomplish what military force hadn't. The official Hu Zongzhan opened talks with Wang even releasing members of his family from prison as a gesture of good faith. Wang offered something that looked, on paper, like a genuine solution. He'd help suppress rival pirate operations in exchange for amnesty and formal legitimization of the trade he'd been running illegally for over a decade. He arrived in Hangzhou in December of 1557, believing he was there to finalize exactly that deal. 2 months later, in February of 1558, he was imprisoned instead. He apparently kept believing, even then, that the imprisonment was just a temporary setback in an ongoing negotiation rather than the end of one. The execution order came down on January 22, 1560. According to the accounts that survive, Wang only understood what was actually happening to him once he reached the execution grounds, reportedly saying he never imagined he would be executed there. He was beheaded in Hangzhou. His family, the same family Hu Zongzhen had released from prison 5 years earlier as a sign of trust, was reduced to slavery in the aftermath. Wang death didn't end the Wokou problem, it just removed its most centralized figure. Without him brokering protection and organizing the trade networks that had kept rival crews from cannibalizing each other's territory, piracy along the coast fractured into smaller, more chaotic operations for a time. One of the men who rose in that aftermath, a pirate leader named Limahong, eventually pushed his ambitions even further than Wang ever had, attempting an outright invasion of Spanish-held Manila in the 1570s before being driven off and instead carving out his own short-lived pirate state at Caboloan, in what's now Pangasinan in the Philippines. The Wokou label had always implied a single coherent Japanese threat. What it actually produced, generation after generation, was a rotating cast of opportunists, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Ryukyuan, operating wherever the combination of trade restrictions and weak coastal enforcement happened to create an opening, with no more to Japan than Wang himself ever had. None of this could have happened, in fact, if Japan had possessed a functioning central government strong enough to police its own coastline. Wang didn't have to bribe or threaten his way into the Goto Islands and Hirado. He negotiated directly with local daimyo, the Otomo and Ochi clans among them, because by the mid-1500s, the Ashikaga shogunate that Yoshimitsu had once used to suppress piracy in the name of trade with Ming China had collapsed into the same fragmented, every domain for itself Sengoku period this channel's covered repeatedly. A foreign pirate lord operating a private fleet out of Japanese territory wasn't a failure of Japanese sovereignty so much as a direct symptom of the fact that, for most of the 16th century, there wasn't enough centralized Japanese sovereignty left to fail. It's the same political vacuum that let regional lords wage their own wars, strike their own foreign deals, and shelter their own foreign business partners without ever clearing it with a shogun who had no real power to object anyway. The Wokou crisis didn't end because Japan suddenly decided to behave. It ended because Japan eventually stopped being fragmented enough to host it, first under Hideyoshi's unification, and then far more completely under a Tokugawa government that shut the entire country off from exactly the kind of unregulated foreign contact Wang whole career had depended on. What happened to his memory afterward depends entirely on which side of the water you're standing on. In Japan, Wang is remembered with something closer to gratitude, credited as a facilitator of trade and prosperity who connected Japanese ports to wider commercial networks and, indirectly, brought the firearms technology that reshaped Japanese warfare. In China, he's remembered as a traitor who armed and enriched a network of foreign raiders at his own country's expense. A reputation durable enough that in 2005, Chinese academics actually vandalized a memorial built in his honor, more than 440 years after his execution. The same man is a regional folk hero on one coastline and a national betrayer on the other, and both reputations are responding to the exact same set of facts, just filtered through opposite national interests. That split judgment is really the whole Wokou story compressed into one biography. The word itself was never a neutral description. It was coined as a deliberate insult. Dwarf pirates, outlaws of Wa, designed to locate the entire problem outside China's own borders and outside China's own policy failures. The maritime trade ban that created the smuggling economy in the first place was a Ming decision. The bounty incentives that encouraged officials to relabel Chinese bandits as foreign raiders were a Ming administrative structure. The single most successful and feared pirate lord operating under that label, the one whose fleet could besiege county seats and rattle Nanjing, was a Chinese salt merchant's son who never stopped being Chinese even while he built his entire empire out of bases inside Japan. 3 centuries of raids blamed on dwarf pirates from across the water turn out, on close inspection, to be a multi-ethnic maritime economy that Ming China's own trade policy manufactured, and then named after the one nationality that happened to be the most convenient scapegoat. The next time someone mentions Japan's feared pirate fleets, the more accurate picture is a failed Chinese salt merchant running an international smuggling operation out of a fragmented, ungoverned Japan, selling guns to samurai on the side, and eventually getting executed by the same government that had quietly profited from blaming someone else for his existence in the first place.